Great. So welcome everyone to our national webinar centering youth perspectives on the SDGs and radical collaboration. My name is Keneisha, my pronouns are they, them, and I lead the RAD program here at Youth Climate Lab. And I'm so excited to be welcoming you all tonight. So we'll get into the next slide. Before we get started, we just want to take this moment to ground the space and get a sense of who's in the room tonight. So if you feel comfortable, I'd love if you can share in the chat your name, pronouns, and the traditional lands that you're calling in from. If you don't know the name of the nations that steward the land and waters that you're on, feel free to use nativeland.ca to learn more, and I'll pop that link in the chat. So we can go to the next slide. As we're naming the lands that we live on, I want to encourage everyone to reflect on this quote on the slide from Naomi Sayers. It reads, "If you're a non-Indigenous person and think land acknowledgements aren't enough and you want to do something more or better, start describing your relationship to the land. Where did your family come from? How did you end up here? What did you benefit, gain, or lose?" We are all treaty people living on stolen land. I'm currently calling in from Toronto, which is home to the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. It's shared under the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Covenant, and Treaty 13. For me personally, as a Black second-generation Canadian who's descended from a legacy of enslavement, I recognize the role that colonization has played in my family history, as well as the ways that I may benefit from or be complicit to colonization now in Canada. So I strive to challenge that complicity and to work in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. In that spirit of solidarity, I want to call out or shout out the March for the Land that happened in Toronto today, during which 5 First Nations from Northern Ontario came down to the city, leading a march calling on Premier Ford to end unwanted mining in their territories. So I encourage you to follow their Instagram at Grassy Narrow Solidarity to learn more and to boost their calls. And I also want to remind that this Saturday is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So if you're not familiar with the TRC calls to action, I encourage you to use this day to learn what they are and to also reflect on where your responsibilities are and how you fit into those calls to action. While you're at it, also check out the calls to action from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Girls, Women, and Two-Spirit People. And get local with it. What are the issues that Indigenous peoples in your communities are facing? And how can you leverage or relinquish your privilege as a settler? Or how can you join movements and stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in your community? I think solidarity is a form of radical collaboration, which kind of brings us to our next slide into this webinar today. So tonight's webinar is the first of our 5-part series for the RAD Cohort program hosted by Youth Climate Lab. So we're excited to hold this conversation as an extension of the conversations that the RAD Cohort is having about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to the wider public, and to celebrate and highlight the insights of our fantastic panelists. So the RAD Cohort, which stands for Research, Activate, and Deepen, fosters youth-led radical collaboration and climate justice approaches to achieve the SDGs. Through the RAD Cohort, youth are equipped with the skills, resources, and connections to transform their communities in ways that are collaborative, intersectional, creative, bold, and relevant. If you want to learn more, we'll drop the link to our website about Youth Climate Lab and the RAD program. So today's webinar will be around an hour and 15 minutes long. We'll start with Soomin talking about radical collaboration and the current state of the SDGs before we'll get into our speakers and our panel discussion. So briefly, before we go on with the next slide, I just want to point out some accessibility and things about the Zoom. So like I said, we have auto captioning. We ask that you keep your mics muted during the webinar, and feel free to have your camera on and off if you want. If you have questions, feel free to submit them in the chat for our panelists. If you want to submit a question anonymously, you can direct message me or Soomin. And if you need any other support or things come up, feel free to also direct message me or Soomin. So that said, I'm going to pass it off to Soomin now.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for making the time to join us today. As Keneisha said, really excited for you folks to be here today and to listen to our fabulous panelists that we have lined up for y'all. Before we get started, I wanted to provide some general context around what are the SDGs, where are we currently at, what does radical collaboration mean, and ultimately how does radical collaboration and the UN Sustainable Development Goals interact with each other. So just generally setting some context for folks before we dive into the panel discussions. So what are the SDGs? We have a wonderful diagram on the screen up here, and you might have seen this before, you might not have seen it before, but these are the 17 goals that are identified by the United Nations as a part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This was an agenda developed to be a plan of action for people, for planet, and prosperity, and really address the interconnected crises facing the world today. And the 2030 Agenda was adopted by all United Nations member countries and is really a universal commitment to advancing prosperity and well-being of all people by protecting the planet and also reducing inequalities. At the heart of the 2030 Agenda are the 17 goals that you see on the screen here. And alongside those 17 goals, there are multiple targets under each of the goals as well. In total, they make up 169 targets. And these are very specific as well. Feel free to check out some of the targets. They're really clearly listed out and provide some really clear guidelines as to what does it mean to address SDG number 1, no poverty. What does it look like when we address SDG 10, reduce inequalities? So if you want a little bit more clear guidelines around what that looks like, the targets are really great first place to look at as well. And to kind of go back to where it all started, in 2015, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon introduced the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And he described really it as the need for transformative development. And it was really a call to action for the world to approach global problems holistically by really tackling the ways that different agendas overlap and amplify each other. All stakeholders are really needed to achieve the SDGs by 2030, including governments, civil society, business, and youth. And what the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda really seeks to highlight is the fact that you can't address one thing without the other. And in order to ensure that we are getting to the more just, more equitable, and climate resilient future, we need to ensure that we're addressing all 17 goals simultaneously. And you can't achieve one goal without, again, simultaneously addressing multiples. But that's really complex and that sounds really challenging. That's why we need collaboration to do it. And that's really at the heart of SDG number 17 in the Partnership for the Goals as well. And something that our panelists will be touching on as well in their own field of work, how they're addressing the SDGs and what kind of collaborations that they're leading in their work as well. But all that to be said, 2015, that was a while ago. Where are we now? We're at 2023. 2023 really marked the halfway point towards 2030. So we're halfway there to the 2030 point since this was developed in 2015. And so a report came out recently about 2 to 3 months ago, highlighting where we're at and doing some assessments around what the current state of the SDGs are. And that report is called the Global Sustainable Development Report. And I can drop the link in the chat in a few moments after this blurb. But it ultimately found that the SDGs are far off track because of the slowness of implementation, and sometimes that the progress has been regressed due to the pandemic, the worsening impacts of climate change, and with the increased conflicts that we see around the world happening today. However, the UN also notes that although these are intersecting crises, and although we see the things that are impacting the digression and the slowing down and the halt and even regressing of some of the SDGs that we've been working on collectively since 2015, because these are intersecting crises, also known as polycrises, the interconnected nature of these crises also serve as an opportunity for transformative action and addressing systemic risks and gaps. And in this report, I thought it was really interesting that they identified 6 specific SDGs as particularly synergistic. And they are number 1, no poverty, SDG number 1. Number 3, good health and well-being. Number 4, quality education. Number 5, gender equality. Number 6, water and sanitation. Number 7, clean and affordable energy. And number 17, partnerships. So although all the 17 goals are really important and play a role in building synergy, and they come into play in different projects and different gaps that we see and different solutions we see as well. Those 6 SDGs were particularly synergistic. And I know that the panelists that we have today are working across these SDGs, all these 6 SDGs especially, and also bring in that SDG 13 climate action lens and SDG 10, the reduce inequalities in their work as well. A couple of just one last thing from this report that I thought was really interesting. Capacity building was really identified as a key focus to support decisive and transformative action across all countries and communities. And again, capacity building is really at the heart of the RAD Cohort program that Keneisha introduced a little bit earlier on, and also this webinar as well. So I've talked about radical collaboration a little bit before, and Keneisha has mentioned this as well, and that's really the central thing that we're discussing today. But what is radical collaboration? Radical collaboration is really rooted and based on the key principle of design thinking. It really speaks to the co-creation and is inspired by the desire to learn from others and embrace diverse perspectives with the process of problem scoping, idea generation, solutions finding, and innovation. So the underlying principle of radical collaboration is essentially rooted in community, equity, and cultural value systems as well. It really allows us to think and work with others in a way that are open-minded, are non-conventional, non-traditional, and are also creative and innovative. Because thinking and collaborating in that way really allows us to spark transformative action and solutions through unusual and unexpected connections for current climate and social inequality problems within our communities as well. And with the term radical, we recognize that this term holds a lot of nuance these days. So we wanted to share this quote from José Villing that you see in the diagram on the right there. And it reads that ultimately, the root of the word radical is root. So what if, rather than treating radical as some form of outlier or extreme, it is a reminder of how we root ourselves, reconnecting the root of what is core, nourishing, and foundational in our work. Our radical selves affecting the fundamental nature of our work and the world we create by how we form the root of fundamental change. And I think that really centers what we mean when we talk about radical. So what does it mean to develop solutions that are rooted in community, that are rooted in equity? How do we address things in a systems thinking level? How do we address things systemically as well? So getting to the root of these conversations and how do we challenge ourselves to collaborate in new, innovative, and creative ways? But how do we now, connect all these things that I've mentioned all together? So ultimately, we cannot get to the more equitable, just, and climate resilient future the 2030 Agenda seeks to achieve without radically collaborating with each other and simultaneously addressing multiple SDGs and really finding new and creative ways of designing solutions that are rooted in community. So that's how you might be able to start to see how radical collaboration and the SDGs really go hand in hand. And to showcase some of that, and to really highlight some of the incredible work that these young people are doing from coast to coast to coast, we have these fabulous panelists here who are embodying radical collaboration in their work and advancing the SDGs in their community. So that was a lot of context building, but I hope that was really helpful in grounding us in the conversations that we'll be having for the next hour. And I'll pass it off to Keneisha again to moderate this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Soomin. Now super excited to introduce our first speaker, Shakti Ramkumar. So a bit about Shakti. She's a climate action and clean energy advocate, passionate about collectively building a globally equitable energy system that operates within our planetary boundaries. Shakti is currently the Senior Director of Policy and Communications at Student Energy, which is a global youth-led organization working with a network of 50,000 young people in 120 plus countries to accelerate the transition to a just and sustainable energy future. And in her spare time, Shakti loves to cook improvisational plant-based dishes, visit cute cafes, and take pretty short walks on the beach. So now I'll pass it over to Shakti.
Awesome. Thank you, Keneisha, and thank you, Soomin, for that overview. That was super helpful for me as well for this conversation. So nice to see you all. I hope I get to hear from y'all later on in the panel or Q&A portion. Awesome. I will kick right off. I have a few slides to start with, just to introduce my work at Student Energy. I'll just share my screen. Okay, is that working? Yes, okay, awesome. Like Keneisha mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Communications at Student Energy. And today I thought I'd share a little bit more about our theory of change and how we approach our work on the SDGs, primarily SDG 7, of course, which is the universal and affordable access to energy by 2030, just so we can tie in our approach with the conversation we're having today on collaboration and on the SDGs. First, a little bit about us. So we're a global youth-led organization empowering the next generation of leaders to accelerate the transition to a sustainable and equitable energy future. And we primarily do this by working with young people to provide energy education, skills training, capacity building, as well as funding for youth to really take action on energy in their own communities and to form lifelong connections that they can use to work in this space. We were founded in 2011 and are currently the largest youth-led organization that is working on energy. This is just a little bit of where we are in the world by the numbers. We've been really thrilled to be able to grow our team over the past few years to really reflect the global nature of our youth network. We have about 41 people on our global staff team in 9 countries. And together we run an ecosystem of 9 programs in our programs ecosystem. And yeah, just a little bit more about the different programs that we do. We've reached 4,000 program participants last year. We have about 61 university chapters. So these are completely autonomous student-led chapters based in post-secondary institutions all over the world who engage their communities on energy. And we've also just recently crossed the 300 mark in the number of actual tangible youth-led projects that we've been able to support. And we're hoping to support many more in the coming years. A little bit about the SDGs that we work on. The primary one, of course, is SDG 7, but it's always interconnected. We work across a couple of the different SDGs, SDG 4, 5, and 8, I would say, are the closest to us on education, on gender equity, and of course, SDG 13 on climate action. But the one we really focus on with most of our time is SDG 7. And SDG 7, I think, like Soomin was mentioning, there's a lot of sub-goals under the SDGs that are actually quite meaningful, and that if we achieve them, we will solve not only some of the key energy challenges we're facing, but also a lot of equity challenges and a lot of social challenges, and really kind of addressing a lot of the inequities we see in this space caused by our current energy system. So I guess that's the good news, is that the SDGs has sub-goals built into it that if achieved would get us a long way in addressing a lot of inequities. The not so great news is the fact that we're not really on track to achieving those. So these are some of the key figures associated with SDG 7. For example, right now, almost 700 million people still lack access to consistent and reliable electricity. And unfortunately, this number kind of went up over the pandemic as many folks who had gained grid infrastructure and access to energy lost it again, either due to rising costs of energy, due to grids not being maintained, and due to rising costs of living that brought people's spending priorities elsewhere rather than on electricity. So unfortunately, this number did go up over the pandemic, which is not great because it was already quite high to begin with. And the number below that is focused on clean cooking. And I think this is sometimes a vastly overlooked issue in the energy sector that Student Energy is particularly interested in raising visibility for, the issue of clean cooking. This number actually hasn't moved very much since the Millennium Development Goals, which were the precursor to the SDGs. And still, so many billions of people around the world live without access to clean cooking. And the impacts of not having access to clean cooking are primarily felt by women and children, whether that's exposure to household air pollution indoors, to lack of time spent on education other tasks because of the time needed to collect firewood and other fuels for cooking. This is a massively complex challenge that hasn't shifted very quickly in the last few decades, but really does need to in the next few years. So it's one that I think I hope rises to the top of the energy discourse globally, but hasn't quite yet. Other couple things I want to point out here is the fact that there are existing energy solutions that we can still invest in more, but we haven't yet, like energy efficiency. Energy efficiency actually has the potential to meet quite a significant amount of our emissions reductions goals if we invest in it sufficiently. But unfortunately, global improvement in energy efficiency is something like, it used to be 1.4% a year. Now it's like 1.3, 1.5. It's not a huge improvement. And this just continues to perplex me because it's an existing solution that comes with jobs, with numerous other co-benefits that just isn't sufficiently invested in. And without energy efficiency, without demand side management and demand reduction, it would be very hard for renewables to actually displace fossil fuels produced electricity. Right now, all the renewables that we add onto our system add on to existing and growing energy demand rather than replacing fossil fuels. But if we were to invest in energy efficiency, we'd actually be able to replace our fossil fuel energy supply and bring down overall energy demand. So that's kind of the context of what we're working with at Student Energy on SDG 7. And I also wanted to bring in some of the challenges that are more youth specific that you wouldn't necessarily find on an SDG report or an SDG tracker. So some of these are from our own research. Some of these are from other reports that have been conducted by other organizations. An interesting, probably not surprising stat to many in this group is about half of global youth surveyed felt that no one's ever asked them for their opinion on the future of energy, not a government or an organization. And this is kind of sad because young people will be the ones to be implementing the policies that are decided upon now. Young people will be the ones voting in politicians and policies, and yet they're not being asked for their opinion. And the next one is interesting. It was from an external survey, not one that we did. And it found that 74% of global youth don't have a clear idea of how they can contribute to solving climate change. They specifically surveyed young people who are at a climate rally, so youth who are already driven and already motivated, but even there, young people felt that they were not given pathways that were clear on how they could personally contribute to solving climate change. And I think that just speaks to the responsibility that organizations have to really expose those pathways that are available to youth, because these aren't things we necessarily get taught in school. So it is very difficult for youth to automatically know exactly what to do at an early age. The next couple are from Student Energy's own research reports. One found that just under 44% of youth who have received post-secondary institution education felt that it did not prepare them for a career in the clean energy sector. And I think this is quite a common sentiment that we hear from youth in our network, is that the industry is moving so fast. The clean energy sector seems to change every 6 months with new demand for skills, for jobs, and there are so many opportunities. But academia just isn't catching up. And there are not enough degree programs, not enough accessible training programs, skills training programs that anyone can access, especially in the global South, that adequately prepare young people to take on those opportunities. So what we see is young people who already have professional networks, who already have, unusual contacts and connections in the energy space. They're the ones that are able to take on these internships and opportunities. But young people who are going through post-secondary education, trying to learn about the sector, are finding that their degree programs just aren't there yet. And the final stat I'll highlight here is there are a lot of entrepreneurs in our network, young people who are really driven to taking solutions into their own hands. And maybe unsurprisingly, about 82% of young entrepreneurs find that financial support is the main barrier to making entrepreneurship feasible for them, but they're not receiving it. It's very difficult for anyone in the climate space to receive finance, but especially young people, because they don't have years of audited financials, they don't have a track record, they may not have an established company. There's all these things that are stacked up against young people that makes it difficult for them to receive that first round of funding, without which they can't really access other kinds of funding. So for those reasons, Student Energy tries to be their first partner in many ways so that they can use us and use their experience with us as a leverage to get bigger and do bigger things, get bigger pools of funding after us. One other thing that I want to share is that the clean energy space is a very exciting space. It's full of opportunities, but it remains quite a privileged space. And some of those are for the reasons I mentioned before. Post-secondary institutions is not exactly a level playing field for youth to get trained up to be a part of this space, but also the clean energy workforce and companies simply aren't recruiting diverse groups of people into their talent streams. And that really shows when you study the workforce. These are some stats from the United States. I won't go through them in too much detail, but it really finds that the clean energy economy workforce in general is older, it's dominated by men, and lacks racial diversity compared to all occupations nationally, which is quite unfortunate and I think very tied to whether we actually achieve SDG 7 and all of its social sub-goals, because not only do we want to transform our energy system from a fossil fuel-based energy system to a renewable and clean energy system, we also want to change the inequities that are present in our current energy system and make those opportunities available to diverse groups of people. I think a part of energy justice and climate justice is the equal distribution of burdens. Who bears the burdens associated with the energy system, where energy projects located? Are they being, unfairly borne by certain communities? But a part of energy justice is also an equal distribution of the opportunities and the benefits that come with transitioning to a new clean energy system. From speaking to our youth network, it won't be a success for young people if we transition our energy system, and yet the opportunities, the benefits, all the good things that we know will come out of a sustainable energy system aren't actually equally distributed. That brings me to our theory of change. Our theory of change is kind of our guiding document that we use at Student Energy to make decisions. This is just a simplified graphic of it. Basically, we start at the top with our end goal, which is a sustainable energy future. And then below that, we have our 6 building blocks. And these building blocks, by all means, they're not exhaustive, but we see as some of the most important kind of conditions we need to have in order to get to that sustainable energy future. So we feel like if we put in place these 6 building blocks, we'll have a much better chance of actually reaching that end goal. These include things like intergenerational equity, cultural shift, policy frameworks, technologies, and we were thinking about, how do we actually contribute to establishing those building blocks? And we picked 2 pathways. One is by creating change agents. So this is really empowering young people with the resources, the skills, the networks, the connections that they need to become powerful change agents in their communities. And on the flip side, we create space for youth to act. And the reason we do this is we know that we can create and help inspire the most powerful, educated, creative problem solvers and incredible young people in the world. But if they don't have a space to actually change the institutions that are currently in power, if they don't have a voice in decision making, it doesn't matter. All we have are a bunch of incredible young people with no pathways to take action. So at the same time that we work with young people, we also work with companies, with governments, with other institutions that currently hold a lot of power in the energy sector, to help them understand the value of young people, to create channels for young people to be heard in those spaces, to be seen in those spaces, and so that agents of change actually have direct pathways to institutions that they're trying to change. I think that might be all my slides. Oh, I have our very convoluted programs ecosystem that I'll end with now. This is just a list of all of our programs, really. And the way we think about it, don't worry about the graphic. The way we think about it is we want to meet young people where they're at in their clean energy journey. We know there are some people who are just thinking about it, who are, just dipping their toe in, wondering if this is right for them. And so we have programs like our Chapters program, our International Student Energy Summit, and our Energy Systems Map, which are very low stakes, low barriers, and for everyone, whether they're committed to energy or not, whether they're just trying it out. So for those who are thinking about it, we have those level of programs. For those who are ready to take the next step and wanting to commit a few weeks to a few months to deepening their energy systems knowledge, we have our next tier of programs, our Try It and Apply It programs. These include our fellowship, doing research projects with Student Energy, joining a youth advisory council. These are a little bit more intensive than simply joining a chapter or attending a summit. And then for young people who are like, okay, I'm so in, I want my first job in the energy sector, we have our career training program, which matches them with companies solving real world problems. and young people learn foundational energy skills, professional skills, and work directly with these companies to solve those challenges. And for young people who are saying, okay, I want a job in the energy sector, but I want to be my own boss, I want to be an entrepreneur, we have our newest program, which is Guided Projects. And here we essentially walk young people from A to Z on developing a community energy project idea, developing a business plan, templating, siting, contracting, working, getting engineers' approvals, all the way to getting boots on the ground and building an actual energy project. We're really excited that a few of our first projects are now generating power and are up and running. It's really exciting to see what young people can do kind of all on their own. And we think, we really hope that us being the first funder for these projects will help these entrepreneurs use that experience to do bigger and better things after us. Because we know the easiest way to get funding is to already have gotten funding, unfortunately. So we hope that we can be that first partner for them. So I'll maybe cap it off there, and we'll pass it on to our next speaker, to Keneisha. But thanks so much for letting me do this intro.
Nice. Thank you so much, Shakti. I really loved what you were saying about youth engagement and that creating space part, I think. Like youth already have that energy and that like passion to want to be involved. And sometimes it's about creating those spaces, you know, and creating those opportunities for youth to be able to jump in. And super excited to hear about those guided energy projects too. That's awesome. And now I'll pass it on and introduce our next speaker, Ceileigh McAllister. Ceileigh is the Youth Network Coordinator with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Canada. She's also an undergraduate student in the School of Environment, Resources, and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. She is most passionate about SDG 13, climate action, and has been actively involved in this space in a number of ways throughout her undergraduate career. So thanks so much, Ceileigh.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. Before I get started, I really just wanted to say I'm always very humbled when people want me to share my perspectives, but I am particularly humbled today, not only by the other people that are on the panel with me, but I'm scrolling through the participant list, and some of the people that are participating and watching are people that I've read about, people that I've watched speak. So that is just a very wonderful, very happy experience for me. My name is Ceileigh McAllister. I use she, her pronouns. Sorry about the spelling of my name. My parents thought they were helping me out by giving me an interesting name, but turns out they were not, because it is very difficult to pronounce. I am currently located on the traditional territory of the Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm going to keep my reflections pretty brief today, just because I am very excited to get into the panel and share about my perspectives and hear everyone else's perspectives on radical collaboration. But I'd love to share a little bit about SDSN Canada, and then a little bit about my opinions and critiques of where we're at for the 2030 agenda. So SDSN Canada, or the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Canada, is a national branch of this global organization of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is working to mobilize academia on the sustainable development goals. At SDSN Canada, I'm very fortunate to work in a team with 3 other staff members. 2 of us are full-time, and then we also have a communications coordinator in addition to me. And one of our primary programs that we run, which some of you may already be familiar with, is Together Ensemble. So I'm so sorry for people who are Francophone or speak French. It's not my strong suit. I apologize. I know I totally just butchered the French word. But this is a conference that we run in partnerships with a couple different institutions across Canada that's funded by the Government of Canada, where we take inventory on where Canada is at for the SDGs on an annual basis. It's a really great opportunity to build partnerships across institutions and across sectors. So we're bringing people together at this conference from civil society, from academia, from industry, a variety of industries, and government. So it's a really great partnerships opportunity. At SDSN Canada, one of the SDGs that is really, or all of the SDGs are very core to our work, but one of the SDGs that is really an underlying foundation of all the work we do is SDG 17, building partnerships for the goals. SDSN Canada and SDSN Global is actually a network. So the objective is that we're connecting different institutions across Canada with the intention of building out a network and supporting collaboration on the Sustainable Development Goals. When it comes to engaging with young people at SDSN Canada, that mostly falls in my lap, and it is a privilege. I love my job. It's so wonderful, particularly because of a lot of the young people I'm engaging with are peers. So it was mentioned, I'm actually an undergraduate student. I'm 21, and I've already been in this role for about a year. So I first started right after, I think I was actually 19 when I started. So I was finishing up my second year of university, and the role really allowed me to learn a lot about what young people care about across Canada, and really mentorship. That's technically a part of my role, but mentorship is really a two-way street. So as much as I am engaging with the people working on their campuses, I'm also equally learning from them. And sometimes I would say, actually most times, I think I'm actually probably learning more from other people than they're learning from me. But I don't really know if that's an age thing. I think that's probably a pretty good mindset to have as you go through your life, keeping an open mind and hoping that you can learn more from other people. The primary program we run related to young people is the SDGs student program. So that was run in partnership with SDSN Youth, which is just another little branch of this global organization. And essentially, if any of you are affiliated with post-secondary institutions right now, or you have been in the past, your post-secondary institution might have had a SDG hub or an SDG alliance. I know Soomin actually used to be the campus coordinator for an SDG alliance back in their days of undergrad. But basically, this is similar to a lot of other, and literally right here, if you're currently doing your undergrad, or even if you're engaged in post-secondary institutions in any way, this is a testimony you should get involved in an SDG hub if one exists on your campus. But oh no, I've lost my train of thought. Not always the best. This is not excellent. I'm so sorry. Oh yeah. So these hubs operate in a similar structure to other large organizations. So in that it is a localized effort towards a particular initiative, in this case, the SDGs. So we provide some resources and we provide this overarching network, but it is largely a local initiative. And what the hub chooses to take on, as long as it's related to the SDGs in some way, is largely at their discretion. I recognize I've already been talking now for like 4 minutes, so I'm going to try and wrap things up on SDSN and about me before I very briefly touch on some reflections on the 2030 agenda. The only other thing that I'd love to touch on about SDSN Canada is I'd love to alert everyone here of a really exciting new opportunity. We're about to open registration for the first ever cohort of the SDG Leadership Program. It is a program that should help young people mix hard skills and soft skills with knowledge about the SDGs. We're hopefully going to be partnering with SDG Academy. And if you participate, you can receive a certificate in a graduate level course relevant to the SDGs, or some flexibility in which course you complete. And then there's a number of hard and soft skill workshops that we'll be delivering that are relevant skills to achieving the 2030 agenda. So things like community-based social marketing, grant writing, things of that nature. So just wanted to plug that here. Keep your eyes peeled. If you follow SDSN on social media, or SDSN Canada on social media, that should be coming out soon. Okay, I think that is the SDSN Canada blurb. I apologize. I'm not as prepared. I didn't have slides, but hopefully I was engaging. Oh, thank you. Dropping the website, always helpful. I hope that was engaging enough. In terms of where I'm at and what I'm up to, A lot of my work with SDS in Canada is largely focused on SDG number 17, but in my personal life and as an activist, I do a lot of work related to SDG 13. Most notably, I'm very passionate about sustainability education. So I've had the privilege, pardon me, of connecting with a couple of people on this call already in my quest to convince the University of Waterloo to ensure that every undergraduate student graduating from the University of Waterloo learns about sustainability as it relates to their field. That was about 2.5 years of very hard and very exciting work that actually culminated with the hiring of a sustainability curriculum specialist earlier this year, which was very exciting. That was probably the highlight of my entire advocacy career. That was great. And that experience, it was difficult, but it definitely taught me a lot of very important lessons, particularly on the importance of radical collaboration, which I will definitely be pulling on as we're getting further into the panel. And then the only other thing I wanted to very briefly touch on my critical reflections on the 2030 agenda. The other lens that I'm going to be bringing into the panel a lot, or I like to think I will, the other lens I bring to a lot of the work that I do in the sustainability space is the lens of critiquing the growth paradigm. And that is definitely something that I consider a lot when I'm doing work with the SDGs. So I don't want to over-explain. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with the idea of green growth versus degrowth. So the idea that we can decouple emissions from economic growth and that we're going to be able to continue to grow the economy, ideally at a rate of 2% or more per year, unendingly, regardless of resource scarcity or energy scarcity. That is the very traditional green growth perspective, which a lot of sustainability works takes on, including, in my opinion, the Sustainable Development Goals. The other prevailing ideology can be a growth, so agnostic towards growth, degrowth, or deep ecology is also very tied to this. So the idea that we actually need to stop focusing on growth and center human and ecological well-being. And in some cases with a growth, whatever happens with growth happens. And then in some cases with degrowth, it's actually a purposeful, what's the opposite of an expansion? Oh dear, the word's right here, but it's gone. Contraction. There we go. Thank you. A purposeful contraction of the economy, particularly in sectors that are harmful. So things like weapons, fossil fuel expansion, and healthcare that is actually not healthcare. That is healthcare that's needing to be taking place because of unhealthy living styles. So a very common degrowth statement to make, something that there's a lot of in literature, is the kind of country that would be the best for someone who supports infinite growth is a country filled with people who are suffer from chronic illness. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of disease, there's a lot of bad things because the GDP doesn't actually consider, it's not moral, right? Like it doesn't think this is a good expenditure, this is a bad expenditure. The GDP just captures every expenditure. And that is one of the really big challenges associated with the idea of keeping economic growth at the forefront, because in a lot of cases, our current economic systems are causing a lot of social and environmental harm. I don't want to get into this too much, and I'm sure this is a lens I'm going to bring to the panel as well. But with the SDGs, I personally don't perceive that there is a whole lot of criticism or consideration of alternatives to the growth paradigm and whether economic growth and green growth is even possible or what possible alternatives are. So when it comes to the 2030 agenda, I would really love to see more nuance in that regard. So again, thank you so much. And I will throw it back to you, Keneisha, to hand it off to the last speaker.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. I think that was awesome. We so appreciate having you. Like, when you say you're humbled, like, we're humbled to have you here. And I really loved the critiques you had on the growth paradigm. I thought that was very interesting. And the opportunities that you shouted out, I hope people are taking notes, and the link that Soomin shared. So sound like awesome opportunities coming up. Thank you. So now for our last speaker, I'm going to introduce Abhay Singh Sachal. So Abhay is a 21-year-old Canadian whose research and work resides at the intersection of climate change, eco-anxiety, mental health, and spirituality. He's the founder of Break the Divide, a nonprofit organization based on principles of environmentalism, sustainability, and reconciliation that focuses on fostering empathy and understanding to inspire local action projects in communities. Abhay is one of 10 advisors in the inaugural Environment and Climate Change Canada Youth Council and one of 20 advisors in the United Nations Environmental Program Faith for Earth Youth Council. Outside of his activism, Abhay is currently a student at the University of Regina, completing a Master's of Education in Educational Psychology. He's also a public speaker on environmental and climate issues, and an avid ice hockey player and pianist. So thank you so much, Abhay.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's so great to be here with everyone today. I am currently in Regina. Like, whenever I tell people I recently moved to Regina, their first question is why. And I've just started my Master's of Education in Educational Psychology here, training up to be a psychologist. And I'll speak a bit about this throughout the next 10 minutes, but I really think a key part of what we need to think about when we're thinking about the SDGs, thinking about growth and thinking about the 2030 agenda is really the emotional component behind change. How do we motivate people to take action, and how do we take care of ourselves in the process? I'd love to start with just telling you a bit about myself. And sorry, my lighting is also something that I'm working on right now. But I'd love to start by telling you all a bit about myself, some of the work that I've been doing in terms of climate action, and then talk a bit more about these bigger themes of the SDGs, what it means to take action, and what it means to engage in radical collaboration. I love the idea, and breaking it down, I think it's so critical to understand what that actually looks like. So my name is Abhay. I'm from Surrey, BC. I spent the last 4 years in Toronto. And I'm currently a student at the University of Regina. I am the founder and executive director of Break the Divide. Break the Divide is a nonprofit that I started with my team back in 2017. And the goal of Break the Divide is to build connections between young people across Canada and the world to be able to understand local and community perspectives and build climate action. What that really involves, and a program that we're launching in January that I'd love to share with everyone, is our Climate Emotions program. So we're connecting 7 pairs of high schools from schools across the country to engage in conversation about how climate change impacts local communities and how that impacts local youth mental health. And in thinking about climate emotions, this new and upcoming field of understanding how climate change impacts the way that we feel, the way that we think, the way that we engage in the world, I think it's so exciting and interesting to be able to connect youth from different locations with one another. Now, when I think about Break the Divide, one of our key ways of thinking about the work that we do is allowing communities to understand and build stronger connections with one another within communities. And a big part of that is recognizing the knowledge that's inherent in each community, whether it's youth that play hockey in Surrey, BC, or academics in Regina, or the queer community in Toronto. Every unique community, whether that's a community that's bound by ethnicity, racial identity, whether that's a community that's bound by shared interests, shared oppression, community can be formed in so many ways. And a key part of the work at Break the Divide that we're trying to do is help communities understand and help communities build frameworks of the knowledge and the frameworks and the ways of looking at the world that each community has. And as we connect 2 different communities with one another to talk about how they think about particular issues, that can inspire so much action. And I'll talk a bit more about what that collaboration process looks like. I'm also part of the Environment and Climate Change Canada Youth Council, advising the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and Minister Soomin on youth perspectives on the climate crisis. And it's the second year of my term on the Youth Council with 9 other Canadian youth. I'd love to be in touch with anyone here if you have any thoughts to share with our ECCC department. So far, as a part of our work, we've been really advocating on some of climate communications and emissions reductions. We've also talked a lot about fossil fuels and phasing out the fossil fuel industry and what that looks like in Canada. And it's been really interesting navigating the complexities of sort of politics and government behind the scenes. Now, what I think about the SDGs that I work on, I really think that some of the key SDGs are Goal 13, climate action, Goal 3, good health and well-being, Goal 4, quality education, and Goal 17, partnership for the goals. Now, at Break the Divide, our work is really centered on all 4 of these goals. We're thinking about the ways that climate change is impacting emotional well-being, good health and well-being. But we're also trying to build programming for youth climate action. And like ultimately partnership for the goals is key, as Kelly and Shakti have talked about. Like it's so huge. And so I think when we're thinking about the SDGs, thinking about them as connected to one another and thinking about the ways that your work can connect with multiple SDGs is so critical. Now, when I think about the 2030 agenda, I think it has been a framework that's provided a lot of opportunity. And there has been progress that's been made. And as Shakti talked about within the context of energy, for example, we've also gone back a bit in terms of how COVID has impacted the SDGs and the progress that we've made. One thing that I think is so critical, though, is that the SDGs, at least in terms of my opinion and my work and experience in working on these things, has been that SDGs are lacking an emotional component behind change. What I mean by this is climate change is big and scary. And the mental health impacts of climate change are something that I've studied and we work on at Break the Divide. Young people around the world are feeling high levels of anxiety, of hopelessness for the future, of feelings of powerlessness. You know, when I've talked to youth activists across Canada, a lot of the emotions that came up were closer to emotions of burnout, of grief, of loss, but also these intense feelings of hypocrisy and guilt, like to contribute to a system that causes harm while advocating to change things. And I think all of these emotions result in moments sometimes where it can be difficult to act. It can be overwhelming. And if we look at society in a broader perspective, when we think about the ways that people don't take climate action, there's definitely an emotional component behind there, whether that's denialism or increased polarization. When we look at people that, you know, blame the wildfires of 2020 on arson, or sorry, the wildfires of this year on arson as opposed to acknowledging climate change. I think a big key of the emotional component behind change is recognizing that sometimes the emotions that underpin people's actions are actually just fear and feeling a lack of connectedness. And so this is where I think when we think of the 17 goals in terms of the 2030 agenda, partnership for the goals doesn't just mean thinking about the specific goals in unison, but it's the ways that we can empower people to build community and come together. When we think of the climate crisis, for example, countries have different reactions. And what we are seeing in some places is an increasing tendency to nationalize, to close borders, to increase fossil fuel production. Whereas what in an ideal world, what the world that I want to build is really one where we're becoming more connected, we're caring for our community, and we're thinking about the goals in unison. And so the emotional component and community connectedness component behind the SDGs is so critical. And I think so far, at a sort of societal and government level, we have lacked the emotional capacity, or we've lacked that knowledge and acknowledgement of the emotions necessary to create change. And so when I think about motivating people to take change and create change, and even again, to Shakti's point earlier about funding and how funding is such a barrier for young people, value shifts are so necessary to change the way that we think about the world, the way that we relate to the world, the way that we might think about our connection to nature, for example. And some would argue that it's even a deeper spiritual shift in how we look and engage with the world. And so I think if I'm also thinking about a reflection on the SDGs and the goals overall, it often feels like there have been partnerships, but there have been a lack of meaningful partnerships, whether that's engagement with young people or the connection between separate goals. If we also think about global action is often dominated through the lens of Western knowledge systems, not just by the global North and the West, but by the knowledge and the knowledge systems, the paradigms of thought, if you will, that like guide us on how to think about climate change. For example, like if we think about connection in nature, and this is something that my master's thesis might focus on, so it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. If we think about connection in nature, do we relate to nature in terms of feeling one with nature, feeling like we are a part of nature? Or in a sense of the SDGs, are we thinking about nature as something that we need to take care of, something that we have an obligation to conserve? And the two different ways of looking at nature, they might seem small, but at a larger scale and at a societal level, they can add up to different changes in the ways that we prioritize people and prosperity behind the solely planetary actions. And so I often think that in a country like Canada, one of the most multicultural, diverse countries in the world, action can look like investigating the ways that different communities think about the issues, the way that different communities relate and conceptualize these different ideas of conservation or climate action or sustainability, and how that relates to different priorities and values that communities have. And one area of growth in terms of the SDGs and progress really does involve connecting with your own identity, connecting with your own communities that you're connected to. You know, I often think about my own identities and the own communities that I'm connected to. And, you know, as a Sikh person from Surrey, BC, I recognize that I have a religious identity that I can tap into and connect with the community there. As someone in academia, I acknowledge that I can create change amongst my fellow peers and other academics. As someone who plays hockey, I know that the Canadian hockey industry has so much work to do to decarbonize, to reduce carbon emissions. And while thinking about my emotions and connecting to these issues in a way that feels good for me, I can build action in a way that actually acknowledges the partnership and interconnectedness of not just the goals, but the people behind the goals. And so ultimately, when I'm thinking about the role and importance of youth for the SDGs, you know, it's not just about the future and the roles that we're going to take in the future, but I think it's really the access that young people have to different communities. We live in such a connected world, and as young people, we're experiencing the world in completely different and unique ways to previous generations. And our ability to act in ways that are interdisciplinary, interconnected, and build partnerships that really that leverage our unique positionalities and leverage our emotional reactions to the world. I think I'll end with this, really, that as young people, we feel the world at a deep level because we can't afford not to. We feel when wildfires hit our friends in different parts of the country. We feel when floods are affecting people that we know in different parts of the world. That's something that we can't control. And even if we don't know people that are directly impacted, we feel the burden of the climate crisis and the action that we need to take. And so I really think radical collaboration and multi-solving means that when we're thinking about the system that we're working in, that can sometimes make us compete against one another. Like if we think about the nonprofit system, sometimes organizations that share similar values have to compete for limited amounts of funds. But if we think about the ways that we can share and grow and leverage our unique identities and communities and tap into our emotions and how we so strongly feel about these issues, we can engage in radical collaboration and take the action that we really do need to take. So I'm really excited for this panel. Thank you for the opportunity to share. I have a new standing desk, and I'm trying to show that off too in terms of my ability to move. And so I hope that was fun too. So I'm really looking forward to the panel. I'll pass it back to Keneisha.
Thank you so much, Abhay. Like every time you're talking, I was just like, mic drop. Like I especially love, like, I wanted to quote, and like I wish I was fast enough to write down like one of the last things you said, which was about, you know, as young people, we feel the world at a deep level because we can't afford not to. I think that really hits, and talking about how emotions are integrated. It reminds me too of like talking about hope in the movement, and how hope is like not a nebulous thing, but like should be like a practice, you know, when it's a skill that we can get better at too, and we can work at and like devote intentional time to. But thank you so much. That was amazing. So now we're gonna head into the panel portion of our call with our three amazing speakers. If folks do have any questions that come up, you can feel free to pop them in the chat. We may or may not have time to go to all the questions that you put in the chat. But yeah, I guess one of the first questions I want to start with for our speakers is kind of something what Abhay said as well, which is, you know, we have a lot of collaborations, but like what makes them meaningful? So in your perspective, you know, what makes collaboration radical, or what makes it something that's meaningful? Shakti, do you want to start us off?
Sure. And oh my gosh, what a privilege to listen to both Ceileigh and Abhay just before me. That was awesome. I was taking notes too. This is great. So what makes collaboration radical? I think what I've been thinking about recently, especially seeing, well, I'll call it what it is. Sometimes it's a circus in the climate and energy space. There's all these events, these like flashy pledges and receptions and things. And I always look around to think like, where's the honesty here? You know, who is really feeling this crisis as a crisis? And I think where I do see that honesty is in youth spaces, and in intergenerational activist spaces who are really committed to working on this together. And I think what makes collaboration radical is honesty. I always think about it sometimes like, you know, in class when you and your friend are a little too afraid to say something, but then you look at each other and you sort of hype each other up. And then because both of you are in it together, you're able to say the difficult thing, you're able to stand up to a teacher, you're able to, you know, say what you believe in because you have that backing of your friend. And I think ultimately, even if it's in a bigger space, a bigger venue, collaboration is really like that. We can be more honest and more, I think, straightforward in how we approach the complex problems in the climate space if we engage in collaboration and radical collaboration. And I think that's something we need a lot more of. I think there's a lot of solutions that are available to us for addressing the climate crisis, for transforming our energy system. And some of it will require to change the way we live our lives. It will require us to change what we prioritize and what it means to live a good life and what we're willing to let go of in this new future that we're fighting towards. And that can be really scary. And so sometimes it can get filled in with a lot of fluff and a lot of dishonesty in these spaces. But I think if there's real radical collaboration, we can kind of cut through that noise and have some real honesty in saying, okay, this is the magnitude of the crisis we're facing. This is the reality check, and you know what we'll need to do to address it. And together we can kind of approach it in a straightforward way. So that's my starter answer. We'll leave it open to my panelists.
I say what Soomin said, snaps all around to all of that. Oh, and Ceileigh, do you have anything to add?
Excellent. Yeah. So this is something I thought a lot about. And I think honestly, what makes collaboration so radical is that we live in a society, we have constructed a society that so aggressively disincentivizes collaboration and makes collaboration so difficult. So as young people who may or may not be interacting with post-secondary institutions, the most immediate example of this is how academia is structured in a very reductionist manner. So we have faculties typically, and then within those faculties, we have schools, and within those schools, we have programs. And I am personally very interested in environmental health as it relates to climate change. And there might be a professor studying environmental health in the faculty or in the School of Civil Engineering. Then at that same school, there might be a professor studying environmental health within the School of Public Health, then within the School of Geography, then within the School of Political Science, then within like the School of Social Development Studies. And the problem is these professors certainly can talk to each other, and they develop avenues to talk to each other. At the University of Waterloo, we have a climate justice working group, which is a forum for professors across different faculties to engage. But notice how a working group had to be made, and the extra administrative burden of developing a secondary body to facilitate this collaboration needed to take place, as opposed to designing our institutions, which fundamentally should be working to like share knowledge and solve social problems in a way that actually supports this. And I would say, like, I use the academia example because that's the most accessible to a lot of us. But for those of you who have experienced like working in government, I'm sure a lot of you understand how government works and how even within one government department, there might be like 6 different divisions doing the exact same work. and they're doing it completely siloed. There's no communication between them, and oftentimes they aren't even aware of what's going on. And so then when you add additional divisions, environment, climate change, Canada, natural resources, the level of duplication is bananas. And then you add in industry, where not only do we have structures that prevent collaboration, but it's actually disincentivized, right? Because if having a really great ESG report or some sort of like decarbonization strategy or something as simple as like eco-efficiency or energy efficiency serves a firm as a competitive advantage, they're probably not going to be wanting to share that around to other firms in that industry, right? So there's a lot of other reasons like cognitive biases, so many reasons why collaboration is so radical and so many valid reasons. But for me, the thing that really jumps out is that we just live in a world where collaboration is so freaking difficult. So when it's possible, even if it's not successful, that's like a win. And then when it's possible, when it happens and it's successful, that's just like absolutely amazing. Anyways, sorry, back to you, Keneisha.
Thank you. I love like the passion, and like people are saying in the chat, like spot on. Do you want to Abhay, if you have anything to add on what makes collaboration?
Absolutely. No, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. We live in a system where it's hard to collaborate, and in order for collaboration to be radical, as Kelly and Shakti have been talking about, like we need a level of honesty and openness. I actually took that note. Like when you know you're in it together, you feel like you can speak honestly and openly, and that's huge. One thing that I'll just add is, I guess, the necessity of imagining and building new worlds and really being, again, honest, but I think vulnerable too about what that world that we're trying to build looks like, and really acknowledging where we have concerns. Like, I genuinely am concerned sometimes that certain rhetoric will harm the marginalized or harm people that face different barriers that you might not think of. For example, like when we think about flying in the context of the climate crisis, I know a lot of people feel very guilty whenever they take a flight. I struggle with that too often. And sometimes I recognize that, like, I have family, for example, in places where I can't reach them by driving or taking a train. And we also don't have a system within Canada itself where we don't have high-speed rail that can connect us. Like if you're getting from Toronto to Montreal, yeah, you could take a VRL, but taking a flight can often be cheaper. Driving can often be cheaper and better. Like the system that we have makes it hard to make certain decisions. And when I think about collaboration, I think about it in a similar lens, that when we're trying to build the world that we're trying to build, being honest and open, but also being very vulnerable and recognizing your legitimate fears and sharing those with other people. I fear sometimes that, the world that we're building will ban flying. And as a result of that, certain people might be left out of certain opportunities and decisions. And, that's just one example, but I think if we can think deeply about our own legitimate fears and being able to share that can create some really honest and open communication that like makes the resultant collaboration a lot more powerful.
I love that. Really talking about that vulnerability aspect. I think that's awesome. Cool. I love all these conversations. We are running short on time, but one thing I really wanted to ask all of you is we do have our RAD Cohort participants on this call. So if there was a piece of advice or a lesson or something you wish you had learned or been told when you were, starting a project, focusing on the SDGs, I guess like what's one piece of advice or a lesson you'd pass on? I guess you can keep it like a few sentences. We'll start with Shakti.
Sure. One advice I think that I wish I'd had is to do some really deep community mapping and network mapping when starting any project. And that's something I didn't do so much of in my early years, but when I did do them, it made a huge difference. And I think especially with the SDGs, since so many things are interlinked in so many complex ways, literally doing a community map of who you know in the space who's already working on stuff, what other projects have already been done, and most crucially, what projects have been successful and what have not been successful. I think even finding examples in the world of initiatives that have been started and then they fizzled out, just knowing that they were tried and they'd had gone well. I think really expanded my understanding of what work has been done in this space, whether it's community-led initiatives or things that companies or larger institutions have done. I would say spending like a whole day on the community mapping piece can be really valuable in starting an SDG focused project. And then the second piece that I will quickly shoehorn in there is that it's really worth getting into those sub goals, because a lot of them have been created with a lot of specificity, and there's a lot of useful trackers and tools to track the actual impact and magnitude of them. So being able to demonstrate the impact of your projects using some of those impact measurement tools that are available that are used across the SDGs, I think would make it really powerful. So those would be my two.
Lovely. Ceileigh, a piece of advice or a lesson you'd pass on?
This took me until this summer to figure out, and I figured it out as soon as the language was put to it to me. As someone not just working in the SDG space, but someone working in advocacy and activism and sustainability in general, it can be very easy to be angry. This is something that was touched on already, but there's a reason why this work needs to be done, and it's because the world is functioning in a profoundly inequitable and problematic way. And it can be very difficult not to hold that anger in your heart. And when I was doing some work, I think I was on a webinar this summer, and someone said hard on the problem, soft on the person as an HR strategy. And I was like, you know what, that's really what I need to embody in my activism a lot more, because it can be really easy to be frustrated with individuals. And I live in Ontario. I'm looking at what's going on with the Greenbelt, and I'm like, what the actual hell is going on? But you know what? Me thinking that my MPP is a crazy person and holding resentment towards individual people accomplishes nothing. That hurts me. That hurts them. And again, getting to that spirituality aspect, that's not good for my soul. That's not good for our collective well-being. And so hard on the problem, soft on the person. It's really upsetting what's going on with the Greenbelt. And it's so great that that decision was reversed, at least for now. But don't be angry towards other people. Having grace and nuance is very difficult when you're dealing with problems, but it's going to make things a lot easier from a productivity perspective, but also for you. Activism is very difficult. Working in the sustainability space is really hard because we're faced with so much crap all the time. I'm writing my thesis, and my thesis advisor, he calls it like a crap circus. And that's literally what it is, because it's just, you wake up, and if you want to spend your entire day on Twitter, you can. And it's just so much, literally, thank you. But hard on the problem, soft on the person, have grace, have nuance, and recognize that we're all functioning with bounded rationality. We're all making the best decisions we can with the tools we have.
I love that. Grace and nuance. And Abhay, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, in terms of advice as you start your projects, I would say two really simple things. Number one, start small. Don't worry about building something that's super big and super scalable from the very get-go. That can come as time goes on. And to the other speakers' points, right? Doing something that is connected to the communities that are in the spaces, something that keeps you sustained, keeps you going, is the biggest thing. So starting small can help with both of those things. I would say the second piece is on that emotional front, something that we alluded to earlier, that hope is a very active process. And as you build teams or people that you're working with, incorporating ways of processing emotions, but also building hope, building ideation for the future, but also getting out some of your frustrations and angers, having that balance can be so important. So really building out space for that and preserving and protecting it. I guess that in and of itself is a radical thing.
I love that. Period. Snap. What a way to end. Love that. Well, that brings us to the end of our time. I really want to thank all three of our speakers so much for your time, for your brilliance, for your insights. Yeah, I wish I was a fast writer because I would just quote you all so much. I'm going to drop in the chat some links to their Instagrams, to their websites, to their ways to stay connected and share with their projects. I see Soomin dropped that. I want to say a last big thank you to our collaborators for the RAD Cohort program, which is the 4Rs movement, Wawanisa Insurance, and Community Foundations of Canada. And a big thank you to our funder under Canada Service Corps. So we hope you enjoyed this webinar. Like we said at the beginning, this is actually just the first of 5 webinars in our series. So our next one is coming up on October 10th, and it's going to be all about art for climate justice. So if that interests you, follow our social medias, keep up on our website or newsletter, and we'd love to have you at the next one. But thank you everyone so much for your time, and I hope you have a lovely evening.